Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. From Tuesday last week through to the weekend just past, General Secretary Xi Jinping was on an inspection tour of Shanghai. During this tour, he also chaired a symposium on the Yangtze River Delta Integrated Development Plan. The Yangtze River Delta region, which accounts for only 4% of China's land area and approximately 10% of the national population, contributes approximately 25% of China's total GDP. Many commentators have compared this tour to Deng Xiaoping's famous 1992 Southern Tour, a message from Xi that after years of pain, it's time for private enterprise to have their time in the sun again. I personally would argue that this is overly optimistic and that we shouldn't expect any meaningful departure from Xi's state-led policy direction. Quote, "The messaging should be bullish for Shanghai, but it was far from some of the hype before the trip that this was going to be something similar to Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour that restarted reform and opening after the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown and subsequent leftward lurch." End quote. Indeed, at one of his meetings, Xi Jinping stated that, quote, "Our socialism aims to follow the path of common prosperity." End quote. In Shanghai, according to state media, Xi, quote, stressed the need for Shanghai to accelerate the construction of the 5 centers, the International Center of Economy, Finance, Trade, Shipping, and Science and Technology Innovation. End quote. Such a focus from the top leader, wrote one Chinese commentator, paints a clear picture of China's long-term development priorities in Shanghai and the path to Chinese modernization. By 2025, Shanghai's expenditure on research and development is expected to account for around 4.5% of the city's gross domestic product. Top policymakers are now expected to convene the annual Central Economic Work Conference, a crucial meeting that sets the tone for economic policy making for the coming year. We will be following the meeting closely. Next up, EU leaders are travelling to Beijing this week for the one-day 24th China-EU summit on December the 7th. We will follow the outcomes of that meeting closely too, but regular China Update viewers know that we shouldn't have too high expectations for the talks. The EU is hardening its view of China, and top Chinese policymakers seem to be stuck just viewing the EU concerns, trade, Russia, human rights, etc., as being driven by US pressures rather than indigenous European concerns. In an exclusive report, Hong Kong-based the South China Morning Post writes that the EU will push Chinese leadership to stop Chinese firms getting around sanctions on Russia. Quote, "Chinese firms were initially excluded from the bloc's 12th package of sanctions, but the names of the companies in question may be added to the list if the EU does not secure a firm commitment to act." End quote. At the summit, General Secretary Xi Jinping will meet with President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, for their first in-person meetings in 4 years. Chinese Premier Li Qiang, Michel and von der Leyen will jointly chair the summit. Top EU diplomat Josep Borrell will join the EU leaders in meetings with the Chinese leadership as the bloc seeks to, quote, pursue constructive and stable EU-China relations, end quote, according to an official European Commission statement. The EU's trade chief has repeatedly expressed concerns over a growing trade imbalance, asking Beijing to reduce the bloc's trade deficit with China and provide a level playing field for EU companies doing business in China. This theme will appear once again at the end of today's video. On Monday, China's top diplomat Wang Yi met with diplomats from the delegation of the EU to China and from EU member states, quote, emphasizing that if China and Europe choose dialogue and cooperation, camp confrontation will not form. If China and Europe choose peace and stability, a new Cold War will not be ignited. If China and Europe choose openness and win-win cooperation, there will be hope for global development and prosperity. End quote, in the words of state media. What are the European views ahead of the talks? Quote, ahead of the December 7th through 8th summit, China has sent a number of conciliatory signals, as it did ahead of Xi's meeting with US President Joe Biden on the margins of the APEC summit in San Francisco last month. Last week, Beijing announced visa-free travel for 5 European countries, In preparatory talks, EU officials say Beijing has also shown a readiness to move on procedural matters.
厉害是吧？还好，明天下午有那个国际接待。
对，明天下午那个不是有个我出来会打个招呼
2点到3点左右，对，没问题，小事啊。你先去吃饭，要不然你会饿。
Expect a proliferation of market access working groups to be rolled out on everything from cosmetics and wine and spirits to financial services. But there is little hope that Beijing will move on the bigger issues, and so the EU is preparing its response. Alongside the conciliatory signals, government proxies have derided the EU as arrogant, weak, self-absorbed, and engulfed in what a Global Times op-ed called a clash of civilizations as the far right makes gains across the continent. Another piece, published in the days after von der Leyen delivered a tough China speech in Berlin, derided her for submissiveness to the US and suggested she was more interested in securing support for a second term than in pursuing the long-term interests of the EU, which, as one might guess, happened to involve even closer ties with China. Some of the harshest messages were delivered by Victor Gao, a Chinese lawyer and academic who was given free rein to lob thinly veiled threats at his European hosts at a Friends of Europe conference in Brussels last month. Gao made a bold and far-fetched prediction that the Chinese economy would grow to twice the size of the US economy within 20 years, and urged Europe to position itself well in a timely manner for this new world, before offering his thoughts on the poor state of infrastructure in the Belgian capital. I was really shocked by the quality of the roads in Brussels, and I do personally want to help, but if you refuse Chinese help, be my guest. The loss is not on China, but on the Europeans, he said. End quote. Hey everyone, if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, I have a huge favor to ask. Subscribing, hitting the bell notification, and liking is one of the biggest ways you can help China Update grow. If the channel grows, it means I can put more resources into it and hopefully transition to doing this as my full-time job, hiring a small team and increasing the quality and length of these episodes. 50% of regular viewers are not subscribed, so if you would like to see this happen, subscribing and liking is a huge help. And for anyone who can help keep the channel financially sustainable, currently it's just me working on these episodes on top of a regular full-time job, and I want to keep the episodes primarily subscriber supported rather than having to rely on corporate support. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Next up, Hong Kong dissident Agnes Chow, who had been arrested in 2020 after Beijing imposed a national security law on Hong Kong to curb dissent, and who was on bail for charges related to alleged national security law violations, has fled to Canada. On Sunday, she wrote in an Instagram post that she had travelled to Canada in September to study at a university. She said she had decided not to return to Hong Kong in December to report to the police, as the authorities had requested, writing, quote, "Perhaps I will never go back again in my lifetime." End quote. According to a US-based New York Times article on this development, before she was allowed to leave Hong Kong, she was taken to Shenzhen across the border for, quote, performative political education on an itinerary that included a visit to the headquarters of WeChat operator Tencent to view an exhibition there on the party's accomplishments. End quote. She said that officials had asked her to pose for photographs at key spots. She added that she was also asked to write a letter of gratitude to the police for organizing a tour that allowed her to, quote, understand the great developments of the motherland. End quote. Unsurprisingly, Hong Kong and Beijing are not pleased with this. State-run Global Times wrote on Monday, quote, legal experts warned that in addition to her previous serious crimes of colluding with foreign forces, Chow is committing a second offence by absconding, and law enforcement authorities can apply to the court. Oh, the People's Liberation Army is flying overhead. Just a minute. We continue with the quote, and law enforcement authorities can apply to the court to confiscate her bail and issue an international arrest warrant through Interpol. Given that Chow is currently abroad, if she is in or transits through a country with an extradition agreement with Hong Kong, the police can request her extradition for trial. Chow's deliberate online announcement of absconding is a calculated move, openly challenging the law and trampling on the rule of law, which is a despicable act." End quote. In an official Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government statement on Monday, the city authorities expressed, quote, "Chow's flagrant disregard for police bail terms showed that she is completely devoid of integrity. No matter what excuses she put forward or how she attempted to deceive and win sympathy, her hypocrisy, disgrace and disregard for law and order are laid bare." End quote. And finally for today's episode, in an article published today with the Beijing Institute of the US-based Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, called "What Will It Take for China's GDP to Grow at 4 to 5% over the Next Decade?" Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis argues that if China's GDP is to continue growing at 4 to 5% for the next decade, either other major economies must be willing to reduce their economy's investment and manufacturing shares to accommodate China, or China must establish policies that cause the locus of growth to shift from investment to domestic consumption. Neither is easy, and the former is unlikely. The piece is excellent and well worth a read for anyone interested in this field. We end today's video by examining several excerpts from the piece, which we are now quoting directly. There are two different groups of economists in China that believe that with the right, albeit very different, set of economic policies, China's economy will be able to grow sustainably by 4 to 5 percentage points for many more years. One group argues that China must maintain the investment-driven and manufacturing-intensive strategy it has followed during the past 3 or 4 years. The other group argues instead that China can maintain high growth rates only if it sharply reduces the investment share of GDP and replaces it with a greater reliance on consumption, something which Beijing has been trying to do for over a decade. However, both strategies face significant constraints that must be overcome if Beijing is to maintain GDP growth rates even of 2 to 3% or less. To take the first group's argument, if China were to maintain current growth rates while keeping its high investment in manufacturing shares of GDP, its share of global investment and manufacturing would expand much faster than its share of global GDP. In that case, it could only do so if the rest of the world agreed to accommodate that growth by reducing its own investment and manufacturing levels to less than half the Chinese level. Even without the geopolitical tensions in recent years and policies in the United States, India and the European Union aimed at boosting domestic investment and manufacturing, this would still be highly unlikely. To take the second group's argument, if China were to grow at these rates while reducing its investment to a more sustainable level, its consumption growth would have to surge. While such a surge is not impossible, it would nonetheless require substantial and politically contentious transfers that would be very hard to implement. There is no evidence that Chinese policymakers recognize the extent of the needed transfers or have even begun to discuss how to overcome political, financial, and economic constraints. Pettis then spends time unpacking the arithmetic behind these assertions before moving to his concluding statements. Unless the rest of the world is willing to reverse its strategic economic priorities to accommodate Chinese growth ambitions, global constraints imply that China cannot continue growing its share of global GDP without sharply reducing the growth rate of investment and manufacturing. The only way to reduce these without a sharp drop in GDP growth would be through a sharp rise in consumption growth. That in turn would require a reversal of the past direction of transfers, with the only sector capable of funding these transfers being the government. But that must result in a sharp change in the roles of Beijing and local governments in the Chinese economy. This change would be difficult. In the days of rapid growth, when income was transferred from households to subsidize preferred sectors of the economy, the main political issue was one of deciding who the winners among businesses and governments would be. Now that rebalancing requires that income be transferred back to the household sector, the political issue is one of deciding who the losers are going to be among the same sectors. Picking winners is much less disruptive than picking losers, and it requires either a transformation of the structure of government or, as has been the case in most other countries that have faced this problem, an acceptance of much lower growth rates. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching, Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.